The Forfarshire, it would later be acknowledged, had been in too poor repair to be sailing, and the decision to try to reach her destination had proved to be deadly. The lives lost and the stories of those who had survived would all be immediately overshadowed by a public who only wanted to know about one person. They wanted to know all about the lighthouse keeper's daughter, Grace Darling. Overnight, her life would be turned upside down.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the Darling of the Forfarshire?
Here we are. Enjoy!
And the screaming of the seabirds foretold a gathering storm, and the passengers, poor souls, looked pale and forlorn. And on every countenance was depicted woe, as the Forfarshire steamer was pitched to and fro. Though William Topaz McGonagall is known for how truly abysmal his poetry is, and we have selected one of the less belabored stanzas, he was by no means alone in feeling inspired by the events of the Forfarshire. Even more captivating to artists and the general public was the idea of the lighthouse keeper's daughter, who had helped with the rescue of some of the survivors. Wordsworth and Swinburne also wrote poems in her honor, while artists rushed to her lighthouse home to capture her image. Soon, her picture would adorn jugs, pottery, chocolate bars, and postcards, while statues of her, or at least inscribed with her name, would soon appear on shelves. In all of the fervor, the name Grace Darling would quickly overshadow the event that had gained her fame. Grace Darling would have never been known to the public if it were not for the steamship, the Forfarshire. The Forfarshire entered service in 1836 for the Dundee and Hull Steam Packet Company, traveling from Hull every Wednesday and from Dundee every Saturday. At 450 tons, the side-wheel paddle ship was equipped for passengers of all stations, as well as cargo. She featured elegant cabins for first class and below-deck accommodations for second that were still considered comfortable. The accommodations for deck passengers were not noted but were unlikely to be any better than most ships of her era. Though the advertisement of her schedule did say that she would only keep to her schedule if weather permitted, there was nothing in the weather to alarm as they left Hull on Wednesday, the 5th of September 1838. This was not to say that there was nothing of concern on the ship. On her previous voyage, she had sprung a small leak in her center boiler, and so before leaving Hull, engineers were hired to patch it. With this mended on the evening of the 5th, the Forfarshire set out on her voyage. On board, she had a full cargo of general goods, as well as 21 crew members, Captain Humble and his wife, and around 40 passengers, though the exact passenger count is unknown since there was no passenger list. The passengers had been able to observe the commotion around the repair of the boiler while still in port, and some had expressed anxiety. One passenger would later say he had heard a member of the engine crew and the captain talking about how they would soon have new boilers and speculating about whether they would have them right away or if the ship would be laid up until spring. Mrs. Dawson, one of the steerage passengers who was traveling with her 2 small children, later said that the news of the repair had alarmed her so much that if she had seen her husband on shore, she would have taken the chance to disembark and go with him instead. No matter how concerned everyone was, with the boiler patched, the ship began to make her way on the voyage she had done so many times before. During the night, the weather became rougher, and the heavy seas near Flamborough Head caused one of the boilers to begin to leak again. The boilers on the only 2-year-old vessel were described in very poor condition, suggesting that her regular voyages had come at the cost of regular maintenance. The leak was such that the pumps were no longer providing the boiler with water, and 2 of the furnaces were put out due to concerns that the boiler would suffer from the effects of operating dry. The vessel continued her voyage even under these conditions, while the crew tried to quickly make emergency repairs. With a boiler and 2 furnaces out of commission, the voyage was becoming a slow one, and 3 other steamers passed her while they were attempting to fix the leak. They were finally able to patch the boiler enough that it would hold water again, and the fires were able to be stoked back up, but it was well known that the repair was a quick fix, not a permanent one. The deck pumps still had to be used to control the water that was coming from the engine so that it would not flood the ship. Under these conditions, it would have been reasonable for the ship to limp into the nearest port to be repaired properly, but instead, they carried on their original route. That night, the seas, which were already on the rough side, were whipped up more by a strong wind from the northeast, and the violent motion of the ship put a new strain on the patched boiler, which began to leak at a much faster rate. The deck pumps were no longer able to control the flow of boiling water that was spewing from the boiler as fast as the engine pumps could pump it in. By 1 a.m. on Friday, the engine crew was no longer able to keep the fires burning in the face of the flood. As the weather began to turn into a full gale, the Forfarshire was now completely at the mercy of the waves. The Forfarshire was equipped with small masts in case of emergency, and Captain Humble ordered that the sails should be set in an attempt to at least keep them away from the land. Looking for shelter from the storm for his battered vessel, Captain Humble decided to turn back towards the Farne Islands in the hopes that they might offer some protection. The Farne Islands seem like a strange place to think of for safety for a ship. They are rocky, and the number of islands changes according to the tide. Between 1740 and 1837, 42 ships were recorded as having been wrecked among them. The darkness of the night, mixed with rain and fog, made visibility difficult, and the vessel was not responding well to the helm. In these conditions, it is believed that Captain Humble made a fatal mistake. Though it is not certain, it is hypothesized due to his actions that he thought that the lighthouse he finally spotted was the lighthouse of the inner Farne. There, he would have hoped he would be able to anchor until the weather became more calm. The light was a false hope, though. What he spotted was a Longstone light, a lighthouse that was surrounded by rocks. At 3 a.m, the ship struck Big Harcar Rock, about a mile from the Longstone lighthouse. As the vessel struck, everyone who knew what had happened could tell that it was a fatal blow. The crew, in a swift act of self-preservation, lowered one of the starboard boats, and 8 crew members, including the first and second mates, jumped in. As the ship struck, most of the cabin passengers were asleep below, including Ruth Van Ritchie, who had been asleep until he was jolted awake by the impact. Not bothering to get dressed, he grabbed his trousers and ran onto the deck as he was. Noting that the sailors were abandoning the ship, he grabbed a hold of a rope and used it to swing himself into the escaping boat. Ruth Van Ritchie had not been traveling alone. His aunt and uncle rushed onto the deck to see the boat leave with him in it, and they attempted to follow his example. He was forced to watch as they both fell into the sea and drowned. The boat was not in anyone's control, though at this point. There was no chance of attempting a rescue. As Ruth Van Ritchie began to bail the small boat with a pair of shoes, the boat was dragged out to sea by the strong current that passed through the Farne Islands. It would later be called a miracle that the current had helped them in such a way rather than dashing them into the many small rocks that were around them. As the ship's boat was dragged away, the same current was dealing the final blow to the Forfarshire. only a few minutes after the steamer had smashed into the rocks. It was brought against the rocks again, this time with a blow strong enough to break the ship in half. The stern, quarterdeck, and cabin were all carried away by the Piper Gut current. The passengers who were still in their cabins were all suddenly trapped below the ocean water, while those who were on the stern of the ship never stood a chance as it was smashed by the rocks and the tides. Ruth Finrichie would be the only one of the cabin passengers to survive the wreck. The forward part of the ship was still stuck to the rock with a few survivors remaining on it, though with the waves battering the wreck and its precarious position on the rock, it was clear that the people who remained were in immediate danger. It was later said that once the ship struck the rock, Captain Humble no longer seemed in control of the situation at all, and his wife had rushed to his side for the comfort that it could offer. They were swept away by the waves in each other's arms. Seeing that they were going to have to do something to avoid the same fate, John Tulloch, the ship's carpenter, and Daniel Donovan, one of the steerage passengers, jumped onto Big Harkar Rock, finding it more stable and safe than the disintegrating vessel. They encouraged the other survivors to follow them. Joining them was Mrs. Dawson and her 2 children. She was the only woman who remained out of the survivors. As they evacuated, they noticed a huddled figure of a passenger, a reverend, who still remained on the ship. Going to encourage him to come with them, they found that he had already died of exposure, his hands still clasped as though in prayer. Unwilling to see his body swept away by the waves as the ship broke up, they dragged his body onto the rock with them. He would not be the only person to die of exposure on the rock as they waited for help that night. Their plight had not gone unnoticed. At Bamborough Castle, a flag was hoisted at half-mast to announce to the area that help was needed, and the alarm gun was fired to wake up the fishermen in order to get a lifeboat out. The waves were too rough for the lifeboat to come near the rocks of the Farne Islands, though, so even though they were aware of the wreck, they were powerless to do anything about it on shore. The wreck was also visible from the long stone lighthouse, and as dawn broke, the lighthouse keeper's daughter, Grace Darling, could see the wreck from the window of her bedroom high in the lighthouse tower. Alerting her parents to the wreck, Grace and her father, William Darling, came to a conclusion. The weather was far too rough for a boat to make it from the nearby town of Sea Houses. They were going to have to do something themselves. Grace had been raised in lighthouses from the time that she was an infant, as the 7th of 9 children born to a man who had himself been raised in a lighthouse, though most of her siblings had moved out as time passed. Grace Darling's letters suggest that she was a homebody, and though already in her early 20s, she was content to help her parents and keep the lighthouse tidy. It was this contentment to stay at home that meant that Grace was the only person available who could join her father in their daring rescue attempt. Taking the lighthouse's 20-foot cobble, they set out towards the wreck of the Forfarshire. The attempt was not entirely foolish. Both William and Grace Darling had spent years in the waters around the lighthouse, and they knew the waters and tides well. They were confident in their ability to reach the wreck. It would later be written by those who were adding to the myth of Grace Darling that she had convinced her father to attempt the rescue, but Grace herself disputed this. She admitted that she was very anxious to render aid to the people she could see on the rock, but that her father, with his years of experience as a lighthouse keeper, making him all too familiar with sea rescues, did not need any urging, and was just as anxious. Father and daughter pushed off from the lighthouse, each with an oar in hand. The route they were forced to take due to the current and poor weather meant that they were not able to take a direct path, and their journey was almost a mile of fighting against the elements. William would later write a report to Trinity House that casually stated that they knew as they set out that they would not be strong enough to make the voyage in the cobble back to the lighthouse from Big Harkar if none of the survivors were strong enough to help them row. It was a big gamble that William and Grace Darling had decided to make. Even once they reached the rock, their little boat was not safe. While William went onto the rocks to help people down into the boat, Grace had to row back and forth and steady the boat, doing everything in her power to keep it from smashing against the rocks. The survivors were in poor condition after their night. Daniel Donovan had a badly maimed leg, and he had been forced to lay for hours while clutching onto a spiked nail, unable to stand. As for Mrs. Dawson, though she had survived, she was clutching the bodies of both of her children who had not been able to survive the cold exposure of the night. William Darling brought 4 of the men and Mrs. Dawson down into the boat, but they did not have room for the remaining 4 men. With a promise that they would return, William and the 2 of the survivors took up the oars, while Grace did her best to comfort Mrs. Dawson, who was deep in grief. Once they had reached the lighthouse, William and the 3 of the survivors returned to the cobble and went back to save the rest, while Grace and her mother began to do their best to make the survivors comfortable and prepare for more. Meanwhile, those on shore were not aware of the daring rescue that had already taken place, and a crew of local fishermen was finally put together for a lifeboat. Among them was one of the sons of William Darling. Several times their boat took on heavy seas, and at one point they hailed a steam vessel that was passing and asked if they could be towed to the wreck, offering to act as pilots for her safety since they were familiar with the waters. The captain of the steam vessel refused, however, and the fishermen were forced to continue their voyage under the power of their oars. Once they reached the rock, they were only able to find 3 bodies, and no one living. They brought on board their boat the bodies of the Reverend and Mrs. Dawson's 2 children. The weather was now so fierce again that they were not able to return to the shore safely, so they turned their course to the long stone lighthouse, which was closer and easier to reach. If they hoped for accommodation inside the lighthouse, they were to be disappointed. There was no more room, with the survivors already making the little space in the tower cramped. They were instead forced to take shelter in a temporary building as the storm raged for 2 days, with waves occasionally bursting through the building to such an extent that they would be forced to run for the lighthouse tower for safety. The day after the Darlings' rescue of the survivors who had remained on the Forfarshire's wreck, a passing sailing vessel picked up the lifeboat that had managed to escape the wreck. In total, there were 19 survivors out of the 60-plus who had set out from Hull. This only left cleaning things up and finding the answers. An inquest was held over the 4 of the bodies of the victims who had washed ashore, and based on the testimony of the survivors, it came to the obvious conclusion that the wreck was the fault of bad machinery that should not have been allowed to still power a vessel. The Forfarshire herself was sold for scrap, and the salvage began almost at once. Grace's life in the limelight had only just begun, however. Quickly, the story of a brave lighthouse keeper's daughter who had taken up an oar and gone to the rescue of poor shipwreck victims gripped the public imagination. Deeply sensationalized accounts of her life and the wreck quickly went up for sale, as did newspaper accounts that depicted her as all that was heroic and noble, a model of what every young Englishwoman should strive to be. The long stone lighthouse's normal, quiet isolation was shattered, as artists and writers from around the country descended. Grace's likeness was soon reproduced many times for everyone to get to know. Nobility also took an interest in her, and money and gifts came flooding in. Queen Victoria sent her £50. She was soon receiving many marriage requests, and turning down just as many. She would never marry and instead chose to remain at the lighthouse with her mother and father, just as she always had. Grace Darling was not someone who embraced fame. Indeed, as all of the attention continued, she became more and more tired of it, according to her family. She was someone who wanted to live a simple life, and it seemed to be thwarted at every turn. William Darling wrote to the papers 5 weeks after the rescue, asking that any other painters who had requested to make images of his daughter to simply take her likeness by one of the 7 paintings that had already been painted. By the age of 26, Grace was feeling overwhelmed, and she had withdrawn more and more into herself. She grew sick, and though her family sought to find her an environment she could thrive better in, she grew even weaker. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis. She spent some time in a house attended by the Duke of Northumberland's personal physician. The Duke had taken a special interest in the celebrated heroine, and had even helped her set up a trust for all of the money she was being sent. Even under his care, though, she grew worse, and when the Duchess came to visit her, it made matters even worse. She began to have nightmares where eyes were staring at her. William Darling finally decided to move her to her sister Thomasin's house, where he hoped familiarity and family would help her recover. The public would still not leave her alone even here, though, and this only raised her anxiety. Grace would finally die in her father's arms. Years later, tired of a world that continued to make her sister into something that she never was and never wanted to be, Thomasin would publish a book full of the family's private writings, trying to let the public know who her sister had really been. No one seemed interested in the truth, however. Grace Darling was laid to rest in a family plot, near where her mother, father, and siblings are also buried. But her grave is not what draws the eye in the St. Aidan's churchyard. In 1844, a stone canopied monument was built in the church, placed in a way that it can be seen by ships that pass by. Under the canopy is the reclining figure of Grace Darling, an oar by her side. Though a sign of the public's unrelenting interest in the heroine of the Forfarshire wreck, it is perhaps also a final favor to Grace Darling, allowing her to rest in peace elsewhere in the churchyard with her family.
For more information, please see Historic England Research Records entry on the Forfarshire, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.